All right, let's dive in. The question of what it actually means for something to be true, well, it's a question that's been keeping philosophers up at night for like centuries. And, today we're not just going to skim the surface of this debate. No, we're going deep.
Right into the deep end.
Exactly. A deep dive into a fascinating and, dare I say, radical perspective. Pluralism about truth.
And for our listeners who, you guys are already deep thinkers engaging with these big ideas, we're talking about the possibility that a statement, it's not limited to just one way of being true. There could be multiple ways, different ways even, for something to be true. And it could all depend on what we're actually talking about.
That's right. And I think, as someone who enjoys a good philosophical puzzle, you've probably felt this intuitively, right? Like the way we determine truth in math, it just feels different than how we figure out truth in, say, moral philosophy. Or even if we're trying to decide if a historical account is accurate, the process, the feeling, it's different, right?
Absolutely. And that very intuition is what's going to guide us as we take this deep dive into what's called alethic pluralism.
Alethic pluralism.
Yeah, alethic pluralism.
Yeah.
Basically, the idea, and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy lays this out really well, is that there isn't just one single fundamental property that all true statements share. There could be, several distinct properties that make things true in different ways.
Okay, I'm intrigued. And so for this deep dive, we'll primarily be using that very entry on pluralist theories of truth from the Stanford Encyclopedia, right?
It's our main source, yeah. And our mission today, especially for our philosophically minded listeners, is to really unpack the arguments for and against this pluralistic view of truth. What are the motivations behind it? What are the implications? Like, how does this affect how we think about knowledge and the different ways we inquire about the world?
All right, I'm ready to get into it. So let's unpack this a bit. This whole idea of pluralism, it seems to come from a pretty simple observation. What makes a statement true in math, it feels very different from what makes a statement true in ethics, right? Or comedy or chemistry. It's almost as if sentences in these different areas, they become true under different conditions, wouldn't you say?
Exactly. And that's the jumping off point for pluralists. They're saying, look, truth isn't this monolithic thing. It's more like a collection of different properties. And within this idea, we have to make a distinction between what we call moderate pluralism and strong pluralism.
Ah, okay. Moderate versus strong sounds important. So what's the difference?
Well, moderate pluralism suggests that, there might be different ways for a sentence to be true, but at least one of those ways, one fundamental truth property, it's shared by all true sentences, no matter what area they come from. It's kind of like a common thread that runs through all truths, even if those truths have other, specific ways of being true as well.
So there's a sort of universal baseline of truth, of truthiness, if you will, plus the specific flavor of truth for, let's say, a claim about black holes or something.
Yeah, you got it. Now, strong pluralism, that's where things get a bit more radical. They're saying, nope, no shared property at all. If there are multiple truth properties, none of them apply to every single true sentence. So the way mathematical truth is true is fundamentally different, like at the core level, from how an ethical truth is true. No overlap whatsoever.
Wow, okay, so a much more dramatic departure from the traditional idea of a single truth. And both of these, the moderate and the strong, they stand in direct opposition to what's called, what was it again?
Monism about truth.
Right, monism.
Yeah, strong monism specifically claims that there's only just one truth property. And that property applies to all true sentences across all domains, everything. And it's this monism that pluralism is really challenging.
But I thought I heard you say earlier that moderate pluralism could be compatible with a moderate form of monism. Oh, yeah, that's right. It seems kind of tricky, but it's possible. Think about it. A moderate monist might say, yeah, there's this one fundamental truth property, applies to everything. But a moderate pluralist could say, okay, sure, but there are also other more specific truth properties in different domains. As long as that monist property is included in the pluralist's set, there's no real contradiction. The strong pluralist, though, they'd completely reject even that basic shared property.
Okay, that's a subtle but important distinction. I see that. Now, what of this scope problem? That sounds like it was a major push towards pluralism in the first place. What is the scope problem exactly?
Right, the scope problem. It comes up when you look closely at what are called inflationary theories of truth.
Inflationary? Like the economy?
Ha, not quite. These are theories that try to provide a substantial account of what makes something true, like the correspondence theory, which says a statement is true if it matches up with a fact in the world. Or the coherence theory, where truth is about how well your beliefs fit together in a system. Right, I've heard of those. Okay, so how does this lead to a scope problem?
Well, the problem is that these theories, they often seem pretty plausible within certain limits. But when you try to apply them universally, across all domains, they run into trouble. Big trouble.
Can you give me an example? Make it concrete for me.
Sure. Let's take the correspondence theory. Seems to work pretty well for everyday statements, right? Like, the cat is on the mat. Seems true because, well, there's a cat, and it's sitting on a mat. But what about moral statements? Like, stealing is wrong. What's the fact that this statement corresponds to? Or mathematical truths like 2 plus 2 equals 4. What physical fact is that mirroring? It's like we're stretching the idea of correspondence way too thin.
Yeah, it feels like we're trying to force a square peg into a round hole.
Exactly. Or take the coherence theory. It might make sense in, say, a legal system. Like, a judgment is true if it fits with the rest of the law. Or in math, a theorem is true if it's consistent with the axioms and rules. But how does coherence explain the truth of just a basic observation? Like, it's raining outside. You could have a perfectly coherent set of beliefs that includes the sun is shining even when it's pouring rain.
So the scope problem is basically saying, look, no single property can really explain why all true sentences across all these different subjects are true.
That's the core of it, yeah. And the pluralist says, why even try to make one property do all that work? It's clearly not cut out for the job. Instead, they say truth is diverse. It's a bunch of different properties. And those different areas of knowledge, math, ethics, science, they might each have their own specific truth properties.
I see. It makes sense. Kind of like how different fields have their own methods, their own standards for evidence, right? Maybe they have their own unique ways of getting at the truth, too.
Right. Pluralists see that search for one universal truth property as a kind of oversimplification. They even make analogies to other concepts like water. We think of water as one thing, but it can actually exist in different forms, right? Like H2O or heavy water, D2O, or sugar, which is, a bunch of different molecules like glucose, fructose. The underlying reality can be diverse, even if our everyday idea of it seems simple.
So the scope problem, it really gives us a good reason to take pluralism seriously. It lets us respect those differences in how truth seems to work across all these different areas.
Absolutely. Instead of trying to make one size fits all, pluralism tries to create a theory of truth that's more comprehensive, more explanatory. It can actually account for why different theories of truth work better in some areas than others.
All right, so we've got the basic idea of pluralism and the big reason why people started taking it seriously. Now let's talk about some of the specific versions of this view. What about those platitude-based strategies? What are those all about?
Good question. Many pluralists, they think we understand truth best by looking at those basic, uncontroversial statements about it, what we call platitudes. The idea is that these platitudes capture something about how truth behaves, what we really mean when we use the word true. So by analyzing these platitudes, we might discover different ways of being true.
Okay, so it's like building a theory of truth from the ground up, using these basic, intuitive truths about truth. And one version of that is discourse pluralism or minimalism. That's connected to Crispin Wright.
Exactly. Discourse pluralism, it starts with the idea that our language, our thinking, it's divided into different regions, different discourses. You've got mathematical discourse, moral discourse, even the discourse of humor. And the idea is that those basic platitudes about truth, they might actually differ between these different discourses.
So what we consider a basic truth about truth in math, it might not hold the same way in ethics.
That's it. And according to discourse pluralism, these different sets of platitudes can lead to different truth predicates, different ways we actually use and understand the word true. And these predicates, they're not just different in words, they point to different ways of being true.
And this is where Wright's minimalism comes in.
Yeah. Wright argues that there are some super basic platitudes, almost like formal rules, that anything we call truth has to follow. Things like the disquotational schema, P is true if and only if P, or the operator schema, which is like it is true that P if and only if P.
It sounds almost like circular, but I guess it's getting at something fundamental.
It is fundamental. And he also includes those parent platitudes, things that connect truth to assertion, like to assert something is to present it as true. Or connect truth to logic, like anything that can be true or false also has an opposite that can be true or false.
So anything that does these basic things, no matter what the topic is, we can call it a lightweight truth predicate.
Right, a lightweight or minimal predicate. But then Wright goes on to say that these lightweight predicates, they can also follow additional platitudes, which add more weight to them. These heavier platitudes might connect truth to reality, like, the classic, for a sentence to be true is for it to correspond to reality, or to permanence, like a true sentence is always true. Or they might disconnect truth from, say, our own personal knowledge, like a truth might exist even if no one can ever know it.
So the idea is that different areas of knowledge, they might satisfy different sets of these heavier platitudes, right?
Yeah.
Which leads to different weights of truth and therefore different ideas about what truth actually is in those areas. Like maybe truth in science is heavier, more connected to a mind-independent reality than truth in, I don't know, aesthetics, the philosophy of art.
Exactly. The discourse pluralist is saying that those differences in platitudes, they're not just superficial. They reflect real differences in the very nature of truth as it works in those different areas.
I see. That's a pretty neat way to try and ground the idea of multiple truths in our basic understanding of the concept itself. Now, what about Michael Lynch's functionalism about truth? That's another platitude-based strategy, right? How does his approach differ from Wright's?
Yeah, Lynch is also interested in truth's functional role, like what job does it do in our thinking and talking. He uses this technique called ramification, where you try to define a term, in this case, true, by looking at all the platitudes and principles that govern how we use it.
So it's not just about identifying different sets of platitudes for different areas, but more about formalizing what truth does in our whole system of belief and making claims.
Right, you could say that. Originally, Lynch's idea was to treat true as like a theoretical term that gets its meaning from this whole network of truth-related platitudes. And then the goal is to figure out, okay, what conditions would make a sentence have a property that successfully plays this truth role?
But our outline mentioned he later shifted a bit, right? He started focusing on the role itself rather than the properties that fill that role.
Yeah, that's right. He started arguing that it might be more philosophically fruitful to identify truth not with those specific first-order properties like, correspondence or coherence, but with the more general property of having some property that can successfully play the truth role, whatever that property might be in a given domain.
So something is true if it has something about it that does the job of truth, basically. But doesn't that sound more like monism again? Like one role, just different ways of achieving it.
You got it. Even though Lynch acknowledges that different properties like a correspondence in one area and coherence in another can fulfill this truth role, his theory ultimately leans towards a moderate monism. There's one truth role that all these different properties are examples of.
Okay, so it's a balancing act. He's trying to accommodate those pluralist intuitions while still holding on to the idea of truth as a unified concept. But I know there have been criticisms of this functionalist approach. What are some of the issues people have raised?
One big one is about circularity. How do we even know which platitudes to use in the first place? Critics, including Wright, have pointed out that if you want to define truth based on these platitudes, well, you already need to know which platitudes are true to even start the analysis. It's like trying to pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Yeah, that's a tough one. If you need to know what's true to figure out what's true about truth, then where do you even begin?
Exactly. Another issue is that if different groups of people have really different ideas about what truth is, then this truth role that Lynch talks about, it might not be so universal after all. It could break down into a bunch of different roles, which brings us back to a kind of pluralism, even though he was aiming for monism.
Right. If what we consider a truth platitude changes from one culture to the next, or even from person to person, then this single unified role starts to fall apart. Okay, so moving on from these platitude-based strategies, we also have correspondence pluralism. Now, I always thought of correspondence theory as the classic example of a monist view. How can correspondence be pluralistic?
Yeah, that's a common misconception. But the basic idea of correspondence, that truth is about matching up a statement with reality, it doesn't actually limit how many ways that matching up can happen. There could be fundamentally different kinds of correspondence, which would lead to different ways of being true.
Okay, so it's not the what of truth, the matching up part, that becomes plural. It's the how, the specific way that the matching happens that can be different.
Exactly. Think of it like this. The relationship between a mathematical statement and, those abstract mathematical structures it's talking about, that might be a totally different kind of correspondence than the relationship between a statement about the physical world, like the sky is blue, and the actual physical sky. What's being corresponded to and the way the statement mirrors it, it can be radically different.
And the outline mentioned Gila Scher and Terence Horgan. They're the big names in correspondence pluralism, right? What are their specific takes on this?
Well, Scher. She argues that truth is always about correspondence at its core. But the specific form that correspondence takes, it depends on the factors involved. Things like logic, physics, morals, whatever, is relevant to the meaning of the sentence. She's not so focused on big domains of discourse, but more on the individual parts of a sentence and how those parts connect to reality. So, logical truths. They might correspond to the basic logical structure of the world. Physical truths to the physical structure, and moral truths, maybe to some underlying moral structure.
So it's a more fine-grained analysis looking at the pieces of a sentence rather than just the overall topic. And this is still moderate pluralism because all those different ways of being true are ultimately variations on that one fundamental idea of correspondence.
Precisely. Now, Horgan and his colleagues, they have a slightly different version. They say there are two basic types of correspondence. Direct correspondence, which is to the blubject.
To blubject.
Yeah, it's their term. Basically, the entire world, everything all at once. And then there's indirect correspondence, which is to specific things within that world. Which type is relevant for a statement depends on how minimal your view of what exists is and the specific context of the discussion.
So really basic minimalist statements about the world as a whole, those correspond directly to the blobject. But our everyday talk about chairs and tables and stuff, that corresponds indirectly to those things, even if those things don't really exist in the most basic minimalist sense.
Right. And this distinction gives rise to two different ways of being true.
Okay, so even the correspondence theory, which seems like the most monist of them all, it can be adapted to fit into a pluralist framework. You just have to allow for different ways that that fundamental correspondence can happen. This is really making me rethink things. Now we've explored the motivations for pluralism, the different forms it can take, but I know there are objections, lots of objections. So what are some of the main criticisms that have been leveled against this whole idea of pluralism about truth?
Oh, yeah, there are plenty. Let's start with the ambiguity objection. The basic worry here is that if true has all these different ways of being, well, maybe the word true itself is ambiguous. Maybe it means something different depending on what we're talking about.
Right. If what makes a math statement true is so different from what makes an ethical statement true, then doesn't that mean we're using true with two different meanings? And if true is ambiguous, that could lead to a ton of problems, right?
That's the worry. Like, how can you even reason properly if the same word means different things in different parts of your argument?
It'd be like talking about banks and mixing up the financial kind with the river kind.
Exactly. But many pluralists, they push back on this idea of ambiguity. Some argue that just because there are different truth properties doesn't automatically mean that the word true has different meanings.
Like that water analogy, right? We use the word water for both regular water and heavy water, even though they have different molecular structures.
Exactly. Others say, well, maybe true is ambiguous in everyday language. And that's just a fact about language, something our theory needs to explain. They might even point to how the words for true have changed over time, or different in different languages, as evidence.
So for them, it's not a problem for the theory. It's just something the theory needs to take into account.
Right. And another common response is to say, hold on, there's a difference between alethic pluralism, which is about the properties, and semantic or conceptual pluralism, which would be about the word or the concept of truth having different meanings.
Ah, okay. So we're separating the idea of multiple truth properties from the idea of multiple meanings of the word true.
Exactly. They argue that those truth properties, they might be way more diverse than our single concept of truth can really capture. Just like the reality of water with all its isotopes and variations is more complex than our simple concept of water.
So this ambiguity objection, it's not a simple knockout blow. Pluralists have some clever responses to it. What's the next objection on the list?
Let's talk about the Quine-Sainsbury objection. They claim this scope problem that motivates pluralism, it's not a real problem. It's a pseudo-problem.
A pseudo-problem. So they're saying there's no scope problem at all.
In a way, yeah. They're saying those differences we see in how truth works, it's not because true means different things or because there are different truth properties. It's simply because those different areas of knowledge, they're talking about different things.
So the reason why truth in ethics feels different from truth in physics isn't because true means something different, but just because ethics and physics are about fundamentally different kinds of things.
That's it. They use the analogy of scoring a goal in soccer. You can score a goal in lots of ways, right?
Yeah.
A direct shot, a header, even an own goal. But that doesn't mean the concept of scoring a goal is ambiguous or that there are different properties of scoring a goal. It's still the same goal, just achieved in different ways because of the rules and the nature of the game.
Okay, yeah, that's a pretty good point. It challenges the whole reason why we'd even want pluralism in the first place. Our outline says that pluralists are still trying to come up with a good response to this one.
They are. It's a tough one. It forces them to really explain why those differences they see across domains, why those differences need different truth properties to explain them, rather than just saying, well, those domains are about different stuff.
Makes sense. What about the criteria problem? That one targets the platitude-based approach, right?
Yeah, the criteria problem. It's all about how do you decide which statements count as those fundamental platitudes about truth. If your whole theory is built on these platitudes, well, you better have a good way of figuring out which ones are the real deal.
It can't just be anything people say about truth, right?
Exactly. The problem is that there's no easy answer. And all the criteria that have been suggested, they all have problems. Like something that seems obvious or widely accepted in one community, it might be totally wrong from a broader perspective. Or something that feels like a basic a priori truth might turn out to be based on some hidden assumptions that are just wrong.
Like the classic example, right? It used to be a platitude that whales are fish. Everyone thought it was true, but turns out it's not.
Exactly. So the problem is that these platitude-based approaches, they might accidentally end up including some false statements in their theory of truth. And if you say, well, platitudes have to be true to count, then you're back to that circularity problem again. You need to know what's true to figure out what's true about truth.
Okay, so the criteria problem is a real issue for that specific kind of pluralism. Now, what about the instability challenge? That one sounds like it could really shake things up.
It does. This challenge is mainly aimed at moderate pluralists. The idea is that if a moderate pluralist says, okay, we've got these different truth properties, F1, F2, all the way to Fn for different domains, well, then you can just define a new property, the property of being either F1 or F2 or all the way to Fn.
So even if there are all these different ways to be true, you can just create this big category of being true in any of those ways, which sounds like a single property again.
That's right. So it seems like strong pluralism just can't be right.
Hmm.
And at best, you're left with a kind of moderate monism, one big universal truth property, even though it's made up of all the smaller ones. Some critics even say this makes pluralism self-refuting.
Wow, okay, that's a big challenge. How do pluralists respond to this?
Well, there are a couple of ways. One is to just accept that this universal disjunctive property exists. But then they say, look, those original, more specific truth properties, they're still the important ones. They're the ones that really explain why things are true in their own domains.
So the universal property is there, but it's not doing the real philosophical work.
Exactly. Another response is to say, hold on, this disjunctive property, it's not a real, genuine property in the first place. It's what philosophers call an abundant property, as opposed to a sparse property.
Sparse and abundant, what's the difference?
A sparse property is one where things that have that property share some real objective similarity, like being red. Things that are red, they have something in common, their color. Abundant properties are more like labels. They don't pick out a real similarity.
So being red is sparse, but being red or a prime number is abundant.
Exactly. And pluralists who use this response, they say that universal truth property, being true in any way, it's more like that second example. It doesn't actually tell us anything about a shared nature of truth. It's just a label.
Okay, that's a bolder response. They're denying that the universal property even counts as a real property. Now, what about those problems regarding mixed discourse? That sounds messy.
It is messy. This is where things get really tricky for pluralism. First, you've got those mixed atomic sentences, sentences that combine ideas from different domains.
Like causing pain is bad. You've got physical stuff, mental stuff, and moral stuff all in one sentence.
Right. And the question is, which truth property makes that sentence true? Does it come from one of those domains or all of them or something else entirely?
It's like trying to fit a square block into a round hole and a triangular hole all at the same time.
That's one way to put it. Some pluralists say that these sentences don't really belong to any one domain. Others say they belong to multiple domains. Lynch, the functionalist, he thinks we might need to paraphrase them to make them fit into one domain. But that's tricky, because paraphrasing can change the meaning.
So it's hard to know if you're really capturing the same truth after you paraphrase.
Exactly. Then you've got Yila Scher with her correspondence pluralism. She says the truth of these sentences depends on a bunch of different factors, corresponding to different aspects of reality. Like, if I said, that action caused moral outrage, she'd want to look at the physical act of causing, the mental state of outrage, and the ethical judgment involved.
So instead of trying to cram the whole sentence into one domain, she breaks it down into smaller pieces and sees how those pieces connect to reality in different ways.
Right. It's a more detailed approach. Then you've got mixed compounds. These are sentences where you join simpler sentences from different domains using and or not, like killing innocent people is wrong and 7 plus 5 equals 12. If those two parts are true in different ways, how can the whole sentence be true?
That's a good question. How do different truth properties combine when you use logic?
Well, functionalists like Lynch, they say that the truth role works differently for simple sentences and for compound sentences. So compound sentences are true if they have the right logical relationship between their parts, and each part is true in its own way.
But that relies on his idea of a single truth role, right? What about pluralists who don't buy that?
They've got other strategies. Some say that the truth of the whole sentence just depends on the combination of truth properties in the parts. Others use these multi-valued logics, where different truth values represent different ways of being true. But it's hard to make this work in a way that's, intuitive and logically sound. It's a real challenge for pluralism.
It sounds like combining truths from different domains is a headache for pluralists.
It is. And then you've got mixed inferences.
Yeah.
These are arguments where the premises and conclusions come from different domains, like all squares have 4 sides. My garden plot is square. Therefore, my garden plot has 4 sides. Seems simple, but if those premises are true in different ways, what does it even mean for the inference to be valid?
Right. The traditional idea of validity, it depends on truth being preserved from premises to conclusion. But if true can mean different things, then what's being preserved?
That's the problem. One solution is to use multi-valued logic again. You could say that a valid inference is one that preserves a designated value, and those designated values could be the different ways of being true. But then, the idea of a designated value might imply some kind of universal truth after all, which undermines strong pluralism.
Wow, this is complicated stuff. It seems like these problems with mixed discourse really highlight that tension between wanting distinct truths for different areas and the fact that we use logic and language across those areas all the time.
They do. It's forcing pluralists to get really creative in explaining how these different truths work together.
Okay, so what's the next objection on our list?
Let's talk about the problem of generalization. This is about how pluralists can handle general statements about truth. Things like, everything Chen said is true, or that classic law of excluded middle, which says that every statement is either true or its opposite is true. If there's no single property of truth, how can we make these kinds of generalizations?
Yeah, if truth is all these different things, how can we talk about it as one thing?
Right. One common response is to say that when we say is true in these general statements, what we really mean is true in some way or another. So everything Chen said is true becomes everything Chen said is true in the way that's appropriate for whatever he was talking about.
So they're using that disjunctive property again, being true in any way, but that's more comfortable for moderate pluralists than strong ones, right?
Exactly. Strong pluralists, they'd have a harder time with this one. And finally, we have the problem of normativity. This is about the idea that truth is a norm for belief. We should believe what's true. But if there are all these different ways of being true, does that mean there are different ways we should be believing things? Like, should we believe mathematical truths differently from moral truths?
That does seem like a problem. We tend to think of truth as one big standard for our beliefs, regardless of the topic.
Right. And pluralists have a couple of responses here. One is to say that the norm is to believe what's true in any of those ways. So you should aim for truth, whichever kind of truth is appropriate.
So one big norm, even if there are multiple truths.
Right. And functionalists, they can use that single truth role as the norm. They say we should believe whatever have the property that does the truth job in that particular domain. So again, one norm, even if the specific properties differ.
Wow, this has been a seriously deep dive into pluralism about truth. We've covered the motivations, the different types, all the objections and the responses. My head is spinning a little, but in a good way.
It's a lot to think about. But what we really wanted to get across is this tension at the heart of it all. On the one hand, it seems like different areas of knowledge just have their own ways of being true. But on the other hand, we want a unified theory, a single idea of what truth really is.
And the big takeaway for me is that pluralism is a really radical alternative. It's saying that truth might not be this simple, single thing, but a much more complex, multifaceted phenomenon.
Absolutely. And for all you philosophers out there, we want you to think about this. How would pluralism change your understanding of your favorite areas of philosophy? ethics, math, aesthetics, whatever you're into. Does it solve problems or does it create new ones?
And here's one final thought to chew on. If truth really is plural, what does that mean for philosophy itself? Does the search for those big universal truths become even harder, or maybe does it open up whole new ways of thinking?
Those are just